she was speaking yesterday at the National Congress of American Indians convention in Washington, D.C. And, you know, this Columbus Day was this week, or as some people now call it, Indigenous Peoples Day. And she spoke to the group and she said, since 1934, every October, the United States has recognized the voyage of the European explorers who first landed on the shores of the Americans. Let me pause that and say, and until extremely recently, those people were celebrated as heroes. They overcame unbelievable obstacles and an entire ocean to cross over to the New World, and in so doing opened up two new continents and essentially began ushering in the modern age. But she didn't say that. She goes on to say, but that is not the whole story. That has never been the whole story. Those explorers ushered in a wave of devastation for tribal nations, perpetuating violence, stealing land, and spreading disease. We must not shy away from this shameful past, and we must shed light on it and do everything we can to address the impact of the past on Native communities today. What's interesting is I'm not positive how we address the impact on Native communities today, other than we take the descendants of people who would have been killed by the natives back in the 1600s and somehow do away with them. What happened? You did have you had a measure of violence with European explorers. The entire world was, what's the way to put this? The civilized world was more violent at that time. There's a story about the practice of sati in India, and when the British occupied India, they were horrified to see widows being burned on pyres that had their husbands on top of them. And there's a story of a British colonel, I think it was, I can't remember his name, but he asked what was happening. They said, well, when a husband dies, we burn the widow along with the husband's body. And the next day, the same fellow who explained it to him saw some construction underway, and he went to the colonel and he said, what are you building? And the colonel said, well, that's a set of gallows. And the fellow said, well, what do you use those for? And he said, well, we use those to hang people who burn widows on pyres on top of their deceased husbands. There's violence. That is violence. Hangings are violence. And it was meted out a lot more commonly then than it is now. But make no mistake, the tribes that the Native Americans, both North and South, those tribes were not necessarily incredibly peaceful. Many of them were incredibly warlike. They were brutal. There's a reason that scalping has passed into the common lexicon. It was a real thing. We also know that in South America, natives there were unbelievably brutal and would sacrifice other human beings, but they would sacrifice even children to their gods. The idea now, when the Spanish explorers came, when the European explorers came, they did use tough, difficult means, but the point was never extermination. The point was not to clear out the land of these people so that they could have it. The point was to expand their nations, to actually bring in new citizens to the crown, and you would see that happen from time to time. But this idea, and the thing, by the way, that killed the vast majority of people was not European violence. It was disease. And of course, that's not a deliberate thing. We didn't even know the germ theory of disease until that time. We didn't have it for, when did that start popping up? It's the mid 18th or 19th century. I can't remember which. So we were hundreds of years away from that. They didn't know what was causing it. So there was certainly no intentionality behind most of that. It was very sad. Now, that does not mean that we didn't make mistakes as well. Smallpox-infested blankets were a horrible thing, not a good thing. But the deal is, conservatives have never acted like the American experiment was perfect. It is an experiment. It's a project. It's ongoing. Kamala actually hinted on that, but then she messed it up. She said, our country was conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all people, a promise that, despite the extraordinary progress we've made through the years, we've never fully lived up to. That's especially true when it comes to upholding the rights and dignity of indigenous people who were here long before the colonization of the Americas began. a couple problems with her statement. The first one is the idea that we would ever actually get there. We will never arrive. We are fallen. We are messed up human beings, all of us, Indigenous people, Europeans, and the folks we've got now. We are all messed up. We will always be trying to get closer to the ideal. But let me tell you something. The United States of America has come closer than anywhere else. We're the last best hope of humanity. We have pushed this farther than anyone else. And the left absolutely refuses to acknowledge that. If Kamala were if she actually believed in what she was saying, you and I were talking about a new directive from Homeland Security. They're going to stop raiding businesses that use illegal aliens. What that means is that you've got illegal aliens who are then going to be allowed to work in places that completely exploit their labor, have them in horrible conditions, and pay them $1 an hour. And there's nothing the government will do about that. That's an enormous problem. If Kamala actually believed that that Indigenous peoples and that poor people deserved better treatment, then they would absolutely be raiding those businesses. They're not. And so they're not raiding the businesses, but they're not closing the border either. That means they absolutely do not care if these people are exploited as long as they get votes from the left. That's all that matters. So at the end of this, what do we take away from it? Well, we take away the idea that the American experiment will never be finished. We are always journeying toward the ideals laid out in the Declaration and in the Constitution. The founders themselves knew that. The idea that slavery still existed when the Republic was founded and continued to exist is not it's not damning to the Republic. It's that the founders themselves, brilliant as they were not able to figure out a way to bring the country together and get rid of slavery, but they believed that it would happen one day. You can look at their writings on that. And sure enough, it did happen. We fought an unbelievably bloody war so that it would happen one day. And Kamala and those on the left seem wholly uninterested in the fact that we fought that war and the forces of freedom won in the end. So she doesn't give America nearly enough credit. I'm not positive you can give America too much credit on this issue.